circling the layers of a community development approach. There's so much more to this practice than we can ever apprehend in our conversations. And you might wonder why we're circling the layers of the early stages of community development so insistently. And I think that many of you have grasped that it's the first set of building blocks in people having ownership, sharing ownership as a group, and really feeling their own power in the work. And, you know, in our culture, we've moved a long way from this. So getting these early stages right is so important to the process. Today, we've invited by video Peter Westerby to share some thoughts that he shared with Neighbourhood Houses Tasmania. And then Carmel and Maria are going to share some thoughts that have been evoked by that video, filling in some of the gaps in it. We'll have both short and long breakout groups to bring your voices into that conversation, quite a bit from you today. And before we get started, it would just be lovely to do a check-in with everybody, but we're always on this tight timeline, aren't we? Well, shall we introduce the video, go in there, and then do the check-in with our breakout after the video? Yes. How about we do that? Helen's in charge of the video, so where's Helen?
Maria's going to introduce it, I think.
Oh, okay, go Maria. You're on mute, honey.
Oh yeah, I was on mute, now I'm not on mute. Hi there everyone, it's lovely to be back with you all again. In this video, you'll see and hear Peter Westerby talking to a gathering at the Tassie's Neighbourhood Houses gathering. And he's talking about community development as a citizen-led practice. A relationship practice as an ethos and layers of practice, where the worker and the people go on a journey together to becoming unstuck, developing relationships of support, new energy for change, and more options for their lives. One really powerful thing that Peter says is that personal problems are really societal problems, and that people themselves are not at fault. They are not the problem, but are in fact the resource. So I hope you enjoy it. It's about 10 minutes.
In some ways, I think it's best to think about community development's history as a citizen project that's been going on for centuries. You know, when people get together and solve things as groups, when they cooperate together, they're doing community development. As a professional project, it's been around since, say, the 1930s in the United States, 1960s in Great Britain, in Australia, 1970s. The Whitlam government sort of started what was called the Australian Assistance Scheme. So that's when we started official community development, and we had employed community development workers.
Is it possible to have a definition of community development?
There are hundreds of definitions. What I prefer to say is, rather than a definition, let's think about community development as having some key movements. And the key movements are simple. I to we is the first movement. There's always a movement from people being alone, struggling with their concern, thinking it's their fault. I'm lonely because I'm incapable of making friends. I'm poor and unemployed because I'm stupid and useless. That's how we often feel alone. But if we can come together with others having the same sort of experience, we can support one another and also transform that idea that it's my fault. Because in fact, all social problems, unemployment, isolation, are not individual problems. They're public, shared social problems. So these are the two movements, I to we, and a recognition that the problem I'm experiencing is not my fault, but it's a social problem that needs to be tackled socially. And some of the obvious diverse traditions would be the community building tradition, where part of our tradition of work is bringing people back together, reconnecting socially when we've become very isolated. Then there's a tradition of community education, where communities say, well, let's get together and learn about the issues we're facing, whether it's, say, climate change or transport challenges. Let's educate ourselves. Then there's the third tradition of community action, where we decide we don't like what's happening in our neighbourhood. Somebody else has made a decision about what's going to happen that we don't like. So we organise and we campaign and we challenge that. Then there's a fourth tradition of community planning, which is how do we partner with local government authorities and say, you're meant to be planning about our neighbourhood, well, we want to participate and partner and be a part of that planning. And then there's actually a fifth big tradition, which we call the community of intention tradition, where people come together and create their own communities, like eco-villages or, actual intentional communities, which is a big movement. The ethos would be a relationship practice. Like, we don't do things to people, we do stuff with people. We build relationships and we come alongside. In fact, my key message around ethos is, if you're going to help people, don't get involved. If you want to walk alongside people, perfect. That's the ethos we need. So there is definitely government-led community development, where governments want communities to adopt things and they'll initiate community development programs. Then there are community-led community development programs where communities themselves self-organise and do things. And we have a very clear approach. We build relationships with individuals. If I'm employed in a community or a neighbourhood, I will go and talk to many people. I'll listen to their stories. I'll hear the key ideas that people are grappling with, the issues, unemployment, access to health, transport issues, loneliness, big pandemic in our society. When I hear different people with the similar stories, I'll invite them to come together. I will literally say, I've been hearing stories from other people who are really lonely. I've heard your story. I've heard her story. I've met this guy who's also lonely. Why don't the four of us get together and have a coffee and talk about this issue? And we'll get together and then we'll say, hey, we've got this shared issue. Let's do something about it together. Hey, and there are a lot of other people who are lonely in our neighbourhood. Let's involve them as well. And then we might start a project. But the practice is clear. If that makes sense. I go and build relationships. I listen to people. I then bring them together and they create their solution. I never create the solution. some community development workers would do that, and we would call that bad practice. So you shouldn't do that. Because what if then you leave? You know, like nothing's going to be sustained because people have got used to you directing. The whole idea of a community development worker is to support people to find their own confidence, their own skills, connect them to resources so that they can sustain what they are doing. Ownership's a key principle of community development, that people feel like they created that project or they started that process with others. And when I say with others, because one of the big challenges in our communities or our neighbourhood centres is, you know, you have someone walk off the street saying, I've got this idea, this is what I want to do. And what we often try and say to that person is, well, you can go it alone and make your project, but why don't you hold that idea a bit lighter? And we actually say, hold that idea a bit lightly and start having conversations with other people. See if you can find 2, 3, 4, ideally 5 other people that together can shape an idea that's a group idea. And then, you know, it's got legs, it's going to sustain itself. You know, energy, passion. Not many people are motivated just because they think it's a good idea. Like, let's face it, you and I, we can name a lot of things that need to be done in our communities. But the only way I'm going to stay involved with something is to really feel heart connection to it, a passion with it. We are conscious, and this is the limits of community development, is that there are very big national and international forces around policy and globalisation that sit behind what is undoing our society. So, you know, how do we challenge that is one of our biggest problems. Poverty is an issue of power. If you're poor, you don't feel like you have any power, and what that means is you don't feel like you have any options in life. You know, you're trapped. So the object of community development, when you bring people together that are experiencing powerlessness, might be social powerlessness, I'm isolated, might be economic powerlessness, I'm trapped in economic poverty, it might be political powerlessness, I don't have a voice politically, or cultural powerlessness, my culture's marginalised, I'm not understood. To experience power is that I have more choices, I have more options. So really that's the true measure of successful community development, that a group of people have come together, tried to create a project or solve their problems, and now they've got more options. They no longer feel isolated and trapped. They've got friends, they've got connections. If something goes wrong, they can pick up the phone and say, hey, I'm at home, I'm sick, can you bring around a meal? And previously they didn't have that option, you know. Or economically, I haven't been able to put food on the table,
Right.
but because I've been a part of this project that's kind of helped me say, deal with
Hi
financial
everyone,
literacy
lovely
with
to see you
others,
again.
or we
Oh
pool
Helen,
our
that
money
was
and
great. I'm so glad we
create
got to see that
savings.
video.
Now I've got more
I
options.
hope everyone
I can put more
enjoyed it.
food
It is a
on the
really
table.
good video. It
Or
really
if we didn't have a
contributes
political
to helping
voice and local
our
government wasn't
understanding,
listening
I
to
guess,
us,
of the CD
now,
method.
because of this community development project,
What we'd like to
we
do
have a
now
voice. And our
is
local
to
council is
invite
forced
you
to listen
to
to us.
a breakout
So we've
group.
got more
It's
choices.
only in groups of
So they're
two.
the kind of measures
To
that people have
obviously
more
to
choices
introduce each
or
other
more
because we
voice,
missed the
I
first
heard,
one.
and
But we'd
feel
like
like
you to
they're not
reflect on the
trapped
video
or stuck.
in light of your own
And that's
practice.
my really
Say, like, what did you
non-academic
hear
definition of
that
poverty.
does or could
To be
relate to how
impoverished
you
is to
work,
feel stuck.
or you
And
work
to
now or
experience
in the
power is
future?
to no longer feel stuck. And I'd
Thomas,
really
I
say
guess, will
to
break
people,
this
you know,
into
really
groups, but this discussion topic
effective community
is
development
going to be put
means
in the chat box,
people
which
as
you can
individuals
access
or
when you're
groups
in the
are no
breakout
longer
groups.
feeling stuck.
So we'd like about
And it's
7
alive
minutes,
again.
and
Wow, I have a
then you'll
choice.
come back
I'm in movement.
to the larger
And we
group.
just need to think about
Okay,
that in
over
our
to
personal
whoever.
lives. You know,
Okay.
we get stuck,
All
hey?
right. Well,
And
thank
we
you.
feel
I
impoverished. So I don't know
had a
what to
lovely
do with my life. I
chat
don't know where to go.
with Vanessa from
And sometimes
Ginger.
we
It was
need
fantastic.
someone
I
else,
hope I
just
get
a
back to the same
friend,
chat next time.
something
But we'll see
to
how
help
it all
us
works.
move forward and get out of that stuckness.
Um,
Well, that's what a community
okay, in that
development
video,
worker is
we
trying to
heard
do. Help
Peter
the community or the
clearly
group
talk
get
about
out
the
of being
ethos
stuck.
of community development, the ethos, walking alongside. I'm now going to invite Maria. Beautiful Maria is going to share a journey. of learning, her own learning, to establish deep listening and moving out of the learnt, ingrained helper role. Over to you, Maria. Thank you.
Thank you, Bea. Thank you. That video is such a great snapshot. Can you hear me okay? I'm not too loud? Okay. That video is such a great snapshot of CD. It makes so many good points. And Rick and I had a great little discussion. I met the new worker at Mullany. Yay! I wonder what stuck with everybody else. Gee, it's hard when we don't know that. But anyway, when I listened to that story some time ago, and just again recently, I heard Peter talking about his process of listening and describing community development as a relationship practice that builds people's ownership, and Carmel is going to talk more about that process in our next segment. Now, I've just got notes here, so I'm just gonna use my notes if that's okay, without losing too much eye contact with people. So when Peter's talking about community development as that you're intentional about your practice and walking alongside people in the journey, and where everyone gets changed, I instantly sort of catapulted back into an experience I had when I was studying, and I attended a workshop by Dr. Lilla Watson, a Gungaloo woman who was teaching at the university, and she was trying to educate us about right way of thinking if seeking to enter community and work alongside Indigenous people. She said, and Peter alluded to it, but she said, if you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. If you have come because your liberation, let's work together. At the time, what Lilla said sort of spun me around. It sort of frightened me, but it also inspired me to examine myself, to examine the I, you know, the implicate is what we've been talking about in the past videos, to ask myself, what's driving my desire to work with disadvantaged people? And it raised real questions about how to be respectful and not to make more problems, but by coming with my own agenda. That is trying to get people to work on my idea in my way. So at the time, I'd been studying with Tony Kelly, and I was learning about community development. I was finding my heart and my head, you know, on fire with, you know, and just the passion I felt was really building. And I felt that I'd found a practice to address social justice and empowerment through collective action, because I like groups of people. I love working with groups of people. So I was pretty excited. So as part of the course, we had to do a little project, and I'd negotiated with a family friend to enter a community project on the outskirts of Brisbane in the west. And I met Rosemary Grundy, and another presentation sister who are living and working from an open house, a bit like the community of intention that Peter referred to on the video. Now, her project was to reach out to isolated and disadvantaged community members, and if desired by the people, to provide a resource to them to address issues that were of importance to them. Rosemary had told me that the women were all living in poverty, many in or recently out of domestic violence situations, and many of the women she had met were under Child Safety's attention. She talked a little bit about her practice to me before I entered her project, and the gentling work she'd been doing to encourage people to speak with her, to speak about their lives, we can share their experiences with another person. And she invited me, to my delight, and she got permission from the women, but she invited me to join her and a few women who had agreed to meet for a shared meal the next Thursday night. So when I arrived at the meeting, there were about 4 or 5 women and an unknown number of children who seemed to be hanging out in the house and under the watchful eye of another sister. Rosemary casually introduced me as a student she'd she'd mentioned earlier. I got some food and found a place to sit, and I felt very much like an outsider, and I was being checked out, of course. As the evening progressed and some terrible stories were shared, I was feeling quite uncomfortable with the lack of responses to the information and the silences. It was painful for me to hear that these women didn't have enough food to feed their children, that the food charity was treating them in a way that was making them feel that it was all their fault. So my desire was to jump in and ask more probing questions or to make suggestions. And I felt quite swamped by my feelings of lostness in the space and sort of ashamed in trying to relate, not being able to relate in the right way. I was really struggling to find the words because really, to be honest, all I was thinking is, how could I help? How could I help them? How could we do something together? I was scrambling around and defaulting to my helper, really well learned problem solver role where I felt comfortable and in control. I knew I was losing feeling with the women, and I was failing in my goal to begin a connection through listening and appreciating each of the women's lived experiences. I made several suggestions which fell flat, leaving me feeling quite at sea and embarrassed. Rosemary made a time for a reflection session. She said to me, "Maria, what was going on for you the other night?" I said, "Oh, I don't know. I just wasn't able to connect or to listen or something. I felt nervous and unsure of myself." And she said, "Do you think you were trying to help them?" And she said, "Do you really think that there is something that you can do to help these women? Can you even begin to imagine their lives, the lives that they've had and the things that they've survived? Did you hear how much strength they've had to have got through that?" And I was sat on my bottom and, she's a wonderful woman, so she didn't seek to humiliate me, but I was feeling embarrassed and I said, "No, I don't know that." And she said, "Maria, it's because you weren't really listening. You were listening for their problems, not listening for their spirit." And then she said to me, "Did you notice what I was doing?" And I told her I hadn't noticed that she was doing much at all, but I felt that there was a quiet understanding between her and the women, sort of like they were relaxing more and more. She said, "Did you hear me directly responding to the hardships and problems they raised? Did you hear me offering solutions to the things they were talking about the other night?" I said, "No, not exactly, but there was a feeling. I did notice there was a positive feeling there, even though you weren't directly addressing the problems that they were talking about, but they were talking about them and they were acknowledging each other." And I just sort of, I could sense that the way it was going, that you guys were probably going to cook some ideas up. Anyway, that's sort of where I got to in that first day, night, whatever. And I found that experience very unnerving, as you can tell, but I understood from it how incredibly important the beginning processes of community development are to creating those connections where you start to begin, you begin to developing ownership of their own story, of the shared experiences. And that I can see how that could lead to chances for getting unstuck. And for those women creating new options, it was sort of a visceral experience. And so then from there, I understood that the emphasis is not about working out the problems and what the solutions are, but about creating this space between you and another person, or between people, or in small group, where there's that feeling of understanding, shared experience. So that is the story from my learning, and I'm very honoured to share it with you, although it's embarrassing. But And I've had Rosemary was the first, well, no, Tony actually was the first, but Rosemary was one of the many great mentors I've had to help me work through that and all the ordering processes in community development and structuring. So thank you for, listening to that. Thanks, Bea.
Maria, thank you so much for your beautiful story, told from your heart. Your story certainly does remind us that we do need to listen deeply in the beginning of our forming the developmental relationship. And we need to listen through the words, but also through the silences. And to stop ourselves from being the fix-it. If we want to practice CD, we have to move away from this fix-it role. Thank you. Thank you again. So that means we go into a group for about 25, have we got 25 minutes?
20 minutes probably.
Okay. 20 minutes. Okay, we've got 20 minutes. So this is going to be a facilitated group. So we have facilitators set up. Now I'd like to say thank you to those facilitators and get them to say hello before we actually break into the group. There's Mark Wishnet. Where's Mark? I'll say hi.
Hi.
Okay. Sandy Ellen Black, you want to say hi?
Hello.
Hi,
And
Sandy
PJ
Ellen.
Humphreys, would you like to say hi?
Hi.
Okay.
PJ.
And Trish, we got you back.
Thank goodness.
Yes, thank goodness, thank goodness. So if we're going to break into groups with those facilitators, and of course with some of us, if we don't have enough, and the groups will be 5 people plus the facilitator. And again, the purpose, as Anne said, is to really reflect on video, what you've heard there. What are you already doing that could be reconsidered, and are there any possibilities to explore this further within your own practice? So we'll go now for about 20 minutes and then we'll come back.
I'll just take us to the kind of final statement, which is looking forward to the next webinar, which is on Wednesday, the 23rd of September. What we've been to date is what we would call, if you can imagine 2 interlocking circles, we've been exploring processes of community development, and we want to move on next week to exploring the structural world within which we do community development and the structures that are important. Yes, so we're going to move on next week to exploring structures. We always think of community development as a set of processes and some structural work that goes along with that. So we'll explore that structural work a little bit, we'll touch on it, and we'll probably focus on some of the barriers you've brought up around funding, accountability, and funding, reporting on outcomes. And so that's our session for the next time round. And I think that's all I have to really say. Please do hang in, come along. We'll share any feedback from the discussion groups today with you. And I'll hand over to Natasha to do the final wind up.
Unmute. So thanks, Anne. Just between now and the next webinar, really encourage everyone to keep in the conversation. It's something that really helps keep this alive. So if there's people in your workplace or anyone you know, to keep reflecting on what we've spoken about today and through the other webinars. We'll send an email following this with a link with information from this and for the next webinar. And we will also, basically we have a poll, and I just want to check with Chris if that's, yeah, all good. So just to finish up, we have a final poll, and then on just any feedback that we can hold from this webinar. And then after that, just like to say now that we also plan to run the next webinar in 3 weeks on Wednesday, the 23rd of September, 12:30 to 2 p.m. So that'll be for the 4th webinar. So just while you've got that on your screen, you'll need to scroll down and if you could answer these questions and submit them back, that would be wonderful. And then as we do that, that's concluding today's webinar.